He used to run his own company. Now he can barely afford groceries, and the person who's about to call him a quitter is his own son. 3 words, that's all it took. You're just a quitter. Words a son should never have to say to his father. Noun, or so he thought. But that night, in a dusty closet, he found something that didn't belong to his father at all. Old boots? A man is not measured by how many times life knocks him flat. He is measured by whether he puts his boots back on the next morning. He didn't quit when his father lost everything. He didn't quit when he lost his wife. And he is not about to quit now. This is the story of the boots that saved a family.
If you have ever been called a failure by someone you love more than your own life, stay until the end of this video, because what this 12-year-old boy discovered in a dusty attic did not just change how he saw his father, it changed everything he thought he knew about what it means to be strong. Before we begin, if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe because we have so many more real, raw, unforgettable stories waiting for you. Now, let's begin.
Daniel Carter had not always been the man his son rolled his eyes at.
There was a time, not so long ago, when 8-year-old Ethan Carter used to stand at the front window every evening waiting for his father's truck to pull into the driveway, waiting to run barefoot across the lawn and leap into arms that always smelled like sawdust and diesel and something like safety. Back then, Daniel ran his own small construction and carpentry outfit, Carter and Doyle Builders, a business he had built from nothing with his best friend since high school, Frank Doyle. They built decks, remodeled kitchens, framed houses for young families just starting out, the kind of work that let a man drive home every night with dirt under his fingernails and pride in his chest. Then came the accident. Daniel's wife, Sarah, Ethan's mother, was killed in a car crash on a rain-slicked highway when Ethan was 9 years old. The world Daniel had built, steady, warm, full of Sunday pancakes and Sarah's laugh drifting through the house, collapsed in a single phone call. Grief did strange things to him. He kept working, because that was the only language he knew for love, but something in him had gone quiet, like a light left on in an empty room. Frank Doyle, his partner, told him to take time off, that the business could run itself for a while. Daniel trusted him. That trust would nearly destroy him. While Daniel was drowning in grief, barely able to get Ethan to school on time, Frank was quietly moving money. He forged Daniel's signature on loan documents, funneled client contracts to a shell company he had set up under his wife's maiden name, and slowly, methodically, bled Carter and Doyle Builders dry. By the time Daniel resurfaced from his mourning enough to look at the books, there was nothing left but debt, hundreds of thousands of dollars of it, all with his name attached. Frank had already vanished to another state, leaving behind a business that no longer existed and a best friend who no longer had anything. Daniel did not have the money for a lawyer strong enough to fight it, and grief-stricken, exhausted, and raising a 9-year-old alone, he did the only thing he could do. He let it go. He sold the house before the bank could take it, filed for bankruptcy, and moved himself and Ethan into a small 2-bedroom rental on the edge of town. He took whatever work he could find, hauling freight at a warehouse, patching roofs on the weekends, day labor gigs that paid cash and asked no questions. The man who once ran his own company now stood in parking lots at 6 in the morning, waiting to be picked for work like the men he used to hire. 3 years passed this way. Ethan grew from a boy who worshipped his father into a 12-year-old who was quietly, deeply ashamed of him. It wasn't that Ethan didn't love his dad. He did somewhere underneath the anger, but grief and shame and 12-year-old logic are a dangerous combination, and Ethan had built a wall of resentment brick by brick the same way his father used to build houses.
He noticed things other kids didn't have to notice.
He noticed the way his sneakers had a hole starting at the toe. He noticed that his father's hands shook slightly when he opened the mail. He noticed that at his school's father-son camping trip, half the other dads pulled up in clean trucks with company logos on the doors, while his father showed up in a 15-year-old pickup with a cracked windshield, wearing a borrowed tent that didn't quite zip. Ethan still remembered with painful clarity the father-son camping trip 2 months earlier, the one that had quietly widened the crack in their relationship into something closer to a canyon. The school had organized it as a bonding weekend at a lake an hour outside of town, and every boy in Ethan's grade had shown up buzzing with excitement about tents and campfires and s'mores. Ethan had been excited too, right up until the moment the parking lot filled with trucks. Clean, glossy trucks with contractor logos and dealership stickers still in the back windows. trucks that announced without a single word that their owners were doing just fine. Daniel's 15-year-old pickup rattled in last, the muffler louder than Ethan wanted it to be, the windshield spiderwebbed with a crack Daniel kept meaning to fix but never had the spare $100 for. Ethan had slid down in his seat, hoping none of his friends would notice, and of course one of them did, laughing about it just loud enough for Ethan to hear from 3/10 away that night. Daniel, for his part, had noticed none of it, too focused on making sure the borrowed tent, a neighbor's old one with a zipper that stuck halfway, actually kept his son dry if it rained. It did rain a little around midnight, and Daniel spent 20 minutes in the dark rigging a tarp over the broken zipper with paracord and sheer stubbornness so Ethan wouldn't wake up wet, and never once mentioned it the next morning. Ethan hadn't thanked him. Ethan had barely spoken to him the whole ride home. It was one more small brick in the wall, one more quiet proof, in Ethan's 12-year-old mind, that his father simply wasn't keeping up the way other fathers were. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in early October. Daniel had lost yet another job, a warehouse position he'd held for 8 months, after the company downsized. He came home late, his shoulders slumped in a way Ethan had learned to recognize as bad news, and when Ethan asked flatly whether he'd gotten the promotion he mentioned last week, Daniel had to explain that no, in fact, there was no more job at all. Something in Ethan snapped. 3 years of swallowed shame came pouring out of a 12-year-old's mouth in words no father should ever have to hear from his son. "You always just give up," Ethan said, voice shaking, eyes hot with tears he refused to let fall. "Every single time something gets hard, you just quit. You quit the business. You quit fighting for the house. Now you can't even keep a stupid warehouse job. You're not trying. You're just a quitter. Mom would be so disappointed in you." The words landed like a physical blow. Daniel stood in the small kitchen of their rental home, a grocery bag with off-brand cereal and discount bread still hanging from his hand, and said nothing, because there was nothing he could say that a grieving, humiliated 12-year-old was ready to hear. Ethan stormed to his room and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the thin walls, and Daniel sat down at the kitchen table alone and put his face in his hands, and for the first time in 3 years, he let himself cry where his son couldn't see. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan lay in bed replaying his own words, feeling a strange mixture of righteous fury and creeping guilt he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge. Restless, he got up near midnight to grab a blanket from the hallway closet, the one place in the cramped rental that still held unopened boxes from the move 3 years earlier, things Daniel hadn't had the heart to sort through. Reaching for a spare blanket on the top shelf, Ethan's hand knocked loose an old cardboard box and it tumbled down, spilling its contents across the closet floor. Ethan knelt to gather the mess before his father woke up, and that was when his fingers brushed against something heavy, cold, and stiff with age. A pair of work boots, cracked leather, soles worn nearly through, laces frayed and knotted from countless retyings. They didn't belong to his father. Daniel's boots were newer, steel-toed ones from the warehouse job. These were older, scarred with decades of use, the leather gone the color of strong tea, one boot bearing a faint burn mark near the ankle. Tucked into the left boot, wrapped in a plastic bag gone yellow with age, was a small stack of letters and a folded photograph. Curiosity got the better of the anger still simmering in Ethan's chest. He sat cross-legged on the closet floor in the near dark and unfolded the photograph first. A black-and-white image of a much younger version of his grandfather, Daniel's father, whom Ethan had never met, standing in front of a half-built house wearing those same boots, a tool belt slung low on his hips, and a smile that Ethan realized, with a small jolt, looked exactly like his father's smile, the one Daniel almost never wore anymore. The letters were written in a careful, slanted hand, dated across nearly a decade, some addressed to "My dear Daniel," and others simply left unsent, folded and tucked away like private confessions never meant to be read by anyone at all. Ethan, feeling something between guilt and hunger, began to read. The first letters were ordinary, a father writing to a son away at a construction trade program, proud, encouraging, full of small jokes about sawdust in the coffee pot. But as Ethan read further, the letters grew heavier. He learned, for the first time, that his grandfather, Walter Carter, had built and lost not one but 2 businesses in his life. The first collapsed during a brutal recession when Daniel was a boy, when banks called in loans overnight, and half the town's contractors went under in the same winter. Walter had been forced to sell his tools one by one just to keep food on the table, working double shifts at a mill for wages a fraction of what he used to earn, coming home each night with his hands raw and his pride in tatters, all while his own son, young Daniel, watched from the same kind of shadows Ethan now stood in. One letter, dated the year Daniel turned 13, stopped Ethan's breath entirely. In it, Walter wrote about overhearing his own son, a young and frightened and angry Daniel, tell a friend on the phone that his father was a failure who couldn't keep anything together. Walter wrote that it had nearly broken him hearing his boy's shame in his own voice, but that he made a decision that night, sitting alone on the back porch in these very boots. He would not quit. Not because quitting was weak, he wrote, but because his son needed to see someday what it looked like for a man to fall all the way down and still get up one more time than he fell. A man is not measured by how many times life knocks him flat, Walter had written, in handwriting that pressed hard enough into the paper that Ethan could feel the grooves under his fingertips. He is measured by whether he puts his boots back on the next morning. I have worn these boots through 2 bankruptcies, a wife's long illness, and more nights of shame than I can count. I am passing them to Daniel not because they are valuable, but because they are proof. Proof that a man can lose everything and still not be nothing. Ethan sat in the dark closet for a long time after that, the letter trembling slightly in his hands, boots resting heavy in his lap. He thought about his own words from that evening. "You're just a quitter," and felt them curdle into something sick and shameful in his stomach. He thought about the father-son camping trip, the cracked windshield, the hole in his own sneaker that his father had somehow, impossibly, still managed to keep him fed and housed and in school despite. He thought about the exhaustion etched into his father's face every single night. An exhaustion Ethan had mistaken for laziness, for weakness, when it had in fact been the exact opposite. It was the weight of a man refusing to put down a load that would have crushed someone with less will than Daniel Carter had. There was one more letter, the most recent, dated only 4 years earlier, written not long before Walter passed away from a sudden heart attack, before Daniel had even had the chance to properly say goodbye. This letter was different, shorter, more urgent, as if Walter had sensed his time was running out. In it, he wrote directly to Daniel about Frank Doyle. "I never trusted that boy the way you did," Walter had written. "Not because he's a bad man in every way, but because I watched him take credit for your ideas back when you two were still in trade school together. Watch your back, son. And if the day ever comes when the ground falls out from under you again, and someday it will, because that is simply what the ground does to men who dare to build things, remember the boots. Remember, you come from people who get back up." Ethan did not sleep at all that night. Instead, he carefully repacked the letters into the plastic bag, tucked them back into the boot exactly as he'd found them, and sat with the weight of everything he now understood pressing down on his narrow shoulders. When morning came, he found his father already awake at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting he, too, had not slept. Ethan walked in, set the boots gently on the table between them, and said nothing at first. Daniel looked up, confusion flickering across his tired face, and then recognition, and then something that looked almost like pain as he reached out and touched the cracked leather with 2 fingers, as though touching something sacred. "I found these in the hallway closet," Ethan said quietly. "I read the letters. I'm sorry, Dad, I didn't know." What followed was not a dramatic, movie-perfect reconciliation. It was quieter than that, more honest. Daniel told his son for the first time in real detail about Frank's betrayal. Not to make excuses, he said, but because Ethan deserved the truth instead of silent shame. He talked about the months after Sarah's death when he could barely remember to eat, let alone watch over a business. He talked about how he'd chosen over and over not to fight Frank in court because the legal fees alone would have taken food from Ethan's plate. How he'd chosen to swallow the injustice rather than risk his son going hungry over a matter of pride. He said the word quitter had cut him deeper than Ethan could know, because some nights, alone, exhausted, humiliated, he had genuinely wondered if his son was right. "But I kept getting up," Daniel said, his voice rough. "Every single morning, even the ones where I didn't want to, I put my boots on and I went out there and I worked because you were still asleep down the hall, and as long as you were breathing under my roof, I didn't get to quit. That was never an option, Ethan. Not once." Ethan, crying now without trying to hide it, hugged his father across the small kitchen table, knocking over the cold coffee in the process, and neither of them cared. It was the first real embrace they had shared in longer than either wanted to admit. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. the only sound the faint drip of spilled coffee off the edge of the table onto the linoleum floor. And Ethan found himself apologizing again, this time not for the closet or the letters, but for every quiet, resentful glance he had thrown his father's way over the past 3 years, for every time he had flinched at the sound of the old truck's engine instead of running to meet it the way he used to. Daniel held his son's face in both rough, calloused hands and told him there was nothing to forgive, that a 12-year-old boy was never supposed to be strong enough to understand what his father was carrying, and that the fact Ethan had cared enough to be angry at all only proved how much he loved the family they still had left. It was, Daniel would later tell people, the exact moment he stopped merely surviving and started, for the first time since Sarah's death, actually wanting to build something again. But this story does not end with only an apology and a hug, because Walter's letter about Frank Doyle had planted something else in Ethan that morning. Not just forgiveness for his father, but a fierce, burning desire to see justice finally done. Over the following weeks, Ethan, with a determination that surprised even himself, began digging. He found an old business card of Frank's tucked in one of Daniel's boxes, searched the company name online at the library after school, and discovered that Frank Doyle was now running a mid-sized construction firm 2 states away under a slightly altered business name, Doyle and Sons Builders, using, Ethan was almost certain from the old blueprints he found in his father's files, several of Daniel's original architectural designs, the ones Daniel had drafted by hand back when Carter and Doyle first started, ideas Frank had simply relabeled as his own. Ethan brought everything to his father with the same stubborn fire that had once fueled his anger but now redirected entirely. At first, Daniel resisted. Old habits of avoidance die hard, and the wound of Frank's betrayal still ached whenever he let himself think about it. But Ethan, echoing his grandfather's letter almost word for word without realizing it, told his father, "You didn't quit when Grandpa lost everything. You didn't quit when Mom died. Don't quit on this too, not because you need the money, because it's not right, and because I want to see you win something for once." That sentence broke something open in Daniel. Not grief this time, but resolve. He spent the next several weekends going through every old file, every email, every scrap of documentation he still had from the early days of Carter and Doyle Builders, and with the help of a young lawyer willing to take the case on a payment plan after hearing the whole story, he formally filed a civil suit against Frank Doyle for fraud, forgery, and intellectual property theft. It was not an easy road. Frank had money and lawyers of his own, and for months the case dragged through depositions and delays clearly designed to exhaust a man with fewer resources into giving up long before it ever reached a courtroom. Daniel sat across a conference table from Frank for the first time in 3 years during one of those depositions, and Ethan, who had begged to be allowed to wait in the hallway outside rather than stay home, would never forget the sight of his father walking out of that room afterward, pale, hands trembling slightly, but standing straight, chin level, the way a man stands when he is told the truth and refuses to be ashamed of it regardless of what it costs him. Frank's lawyers tried 3 separate times to have the case dismissed on technicalities. Twice they offered Daniel a quiet, under-the-table settlement far smaller than what he was owed, with a strict non-disclosure clause attached, clearly hoping the promise of quick, easy money would tempt a struggling single father into silence. Daniel refused both times, even when the young lawyer handling his case gently reminded him how much easier and faster it would be to simply take the money and move on. "My father spent his whole life getting back up quietly," Daniel told him. "I think it's time somebody in this family got back up loudly." But Daniel, boots literally sitting by the front door now as a daily reminder, did not give up. Word slowly spread through their small town about what had happened. A local news outlet picked up the story after the court documents became public record, running a piece about a hard-working single father who had quietly rebuilt his life from nothing, after being betrayed by his own business partner, only to fight back years later for his son's sake. The story struck a chord. Old clients of Carter and Doyle Builders came forward with their own memories of Daniel's honest work, and Frank's questionable billing practices. A former employee testified about overhearing Frank discuss restructuring the paperwork right after Sarah's death. Piece by piece, the truth that Walter Carter had warned about years earlier came into the light. Neighbors who used to nod politely but distantly at Daniel in the grocery store now stopped to shake his hand. The owner of the hardware store where Daniel had quietly bought discounted dented tools for years pulled him aside one afternoon and told him, in front of Ethan, that he'd always known there was more to the Carter and Doyle story than people assumed, and that he was proud to finally see it set right. Even Ethan's classmates, the same boys who had laughed at the cracked windshield in the campground parking lot, began asking Ethan what it had actually been like watching his dad take on a big construction company and win. And for the first time in years, Ethan found himself standing a little taller when he talked about his father instead of shrinking smaller. The case ultimately settled out of court, with Frank Doyle agreeing to a significant financial settlement and a public correction crediting the original architectural designs to Daniel Carter. It was not the kind of dramatic courtroom victory from movies, but it was enough. Enough to clear Daniel's name. Enough to pay off the last of the old business debts that had haunted him for 3 years. And enough, for the first time since Sarah's death, to give Daniel Carter something he thought he had lost forever. A future he could build with his own 2 hands again. Honestly, in the open. With the settlement money and, more importantly, his restored reputation, Daniel did not chase revenge any further, and he did not try to rebuild the old company under the old name. Instead, he started something new, smaller, humbler, a one-man carpentry shop in a rented storefront on Main Street, with a hand-painted sign above the door that read simply, Walter & Son Builders. Inside, mounted on a small wooden shelf by the register, in a place customers would see the moment they walked in, sat a pair of cracked leather work boots too fragile now to wear, kept instead as a monument to everything they represented. Ethan spent that following summer working alongside his father in the shop after school let out, sanding wood, sweeping sawdust, learning to read blueprints the way his father and grandfather once had. At first, his contributions were small, sweeping floors, organizing screws by size into old coffee cans, fetching tools whose names he mispronounced more often than not. But Daniel never once made him feel like a burden for wanting to be there. Some evenings, after the shop had closed and the streetlights outside Main Street flickered on, father and son would sit together at the workbench with 2 cups of hot chocolate, Daniel patiently showing Ethan how to measure twice and cut once, how to sand with the grain instead of against it, how to listen to wood the way his own father had taught him decades earlier. Ethan noticed, slowly, that his father laughed more in that little shop than he had in the 3 hardest years of Ethan's memory combined. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind that used to fill their old house before the accident. It was as though rebuilding something with his hands again had given Daniel back a piece of himself that grief and betrayal had buried for years. The distance and shame that had grown between them over 3 hard years slowly filled back in, plank by plank, the way a house is built, not all at once, but one careful piece fitted against another until it can hold weight again. On the 1-year anniversary of the day Ethan found the boots, Daniel gave his son a small worn leather journal that had belonged to Walter, its pages filled with sketches, measurements, and small handwritten notes about the value of honest work. Inside the front cover, Daniel had added his own inscription beneath his father's original one. For Ethan, you were the reason I never stopped getting up. Never let anyone, including yourself, tell you that surviving isn't the same thing as fighting. Ethan kept that journal on his nightstand from that day forward, and on the nights when schoolwork or friendships or the ordinary weight of growing up felt heavier than he could carry, he would open it to his father's handwriting and remember the boots, the letters, and the closet floor where he first learned what real strength actually looked like. Years later, when people in town asked Ethan Carter, by then a young man himself apprenticing full-time at his father's now thriving shop, what it meant to be strong, he would tell them a story about a pair of old work boots found by accident in a hallway closet, on the worst night of his young life boots, that had taught him more about his father, and about himself, than any lecture or apology ever could have. He would tell them that quitting and surviving are not the same word wearing different clothes, no matter how similar they might look from the outside to a hurting, frightened 12-year-old boy who didn't yet understand what it cost his father simply to keep waking up every single morning, and he would tell them, always, with a quiet pride that mirrored the smile in that old black-and-white photograph, that his father, his tired, humble, endlessly persistent father, was the strongest man he had ever known, not because he never fell, but because he never once forgot how to put his boots back on. If this story touched something in you tonight, remember that the people who look the weakest on the outside are often carrying the heaviest weight in silence. And remember to be a little gentler with the ones who love you before you have to find their old boots in a closet to finally understand them. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed because there are so many more waiting for you.